Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our featured speaker, Lowell Bergman, and our moderator, Diane Dwyer.
All right, thank you. Yeah, well, Lowell is going out saving the world. I was in Beijing covering the Olympics, and it was pretty cool, actually. Different approaches, but we're going to focus mostly on international investigative reporting and investigative reporting in general. But when we open it up to questions, which we're going to do pretty early on with sort of our thought, is we can venture into other worlds. As soon as Lowell and I started talking, we're going in 5,000 different directions, and I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions in different directions also in the state of news here in the Bay Area and this country as well. The one thing that Martin left out was that Al Pacino played you in the movie. Pretty cool. So, and did you mention the Pulitzer Prize too? Did you mention that one? I don't know. No. Anyway, the Pulitzer Prize in Public Service in 2004 was to the New York Times and Lowell Bergman and David Barstow. And the reports examined the deaths and injury among American workers, essentially.
In the iron foundry industry.
Okay. And a personal side, because I sort of do the TV thing, he's married. He has 5 children and 4 grandchildren. Am I correct?
We're up to 6.
6. It was updated since the last since whatever I found out. All right. So thank you very much for being here.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
We're glad to have you. So one of the things we were talking about.
Oh, one correction. I stopped working for the New York Times in 2008 as a full-time as a reporter.
But you still do freelance work there. Yeah. That counts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, and I should say about the Pulitzer Prize, what's interesting about it is that it was first time it was given also to a joint documentary and print project, and 2 graduate students at UC Berkeley were part of the project, and I was just at the New York Times 2 weeks ago, and in their Pulitzer Prize, they have like a hallway with all the Pulitzer Prizes, and it's the only one with graduate students in journalism faces in it. So
that's pretty great.
Yeah.
And from Berkeley.
Yeah, from Berkeley.
Very nice. One of the big things going on right now in the news, obviously, is the presidential election. And so we'll venture off into the international world by starting kind of here. And the Citizens United decision we were just talking about with the Supreme Court is really having its first big impact nationally because of this presidential race. And the decision overturned laws that restricted limits on corporate financing and political campaigns, and a lot more than that, but essentially allowed a free flow of money into political campaigns. And if you've watched Stephen Colbert, the comedy reporter who pretends to be a news anchor, he's been doing a whole sort of expose on how easy it is to start up a super PAC and to run commercials in South Carolina and everywhere else in Florida now, bashing different politicians. So it's been first time it's sort of gotten out to the masses on this comedic side, which is sort of interesting. So I guess the first question I would ask is, how important do you think that decision is now and going forward for the next 9 months of this election campaign?
Well, first of all, those of us who are old enough to remember the Nixon administration and Watergate, that's when the restrictions came about on what you could give and when you could give it. And actually, there's a little clip I can show you about how that happened. And so what happened as a result of Citizens United is there's really an unlimited amount of money, which is the way it used to be before in 1973, in terms of corporations, unions, or other organizations or individuals to give money to a campaign. Of course, there's a catch. They have to give the money to what's called a PAC.
Right.
They can't give it to the campaign directly, but to express their ideas or what they support. And one thing to keep in mind, you'll see this in the coverage, I think, over the next couple of weeks. You may have noticed that all of a sudden Newt Gingrich looked like he was fading, and then he got $5 million from a casino owner based in Las Vegas named Sheldon Adelson. And then after that helped disrupt the progress of, let's say, Mitt Romney in South Carolina, then another $5 million came from the owner's wife, Miriam, for Florida, and that's going on right now, and that's revived his campaign. If you look at We have a program here at the Graduate School of Journalism called the Investigative Reporting Program, and we have a unique postgraduate fellow part of it where we bring young reporters, usually graduates of the journalism school, back for a year. And one of them has stayed on. He was supposed to be there for a year. He's now in his third year. And what he's been doing and what we've been focusing on is international corruption investigations. And it's stories that we published with Reuters about 2 years ago about Mr. Adelson's operations, where his real money-making operations are in Macau, in China. He is the largest foreign operator in Macau, which is the world center of gambling. That's where his money's coming from. The articles, primarily, the articles lay out his relationship and his company's relationship with Chinese organized crime. It's laid out in those words. And there was a follow-up article a year later with WikiLeaks cables from inside the US government confirming everything we said before. And there's been some court filings where they have now admitted that that's what they were doing. They are still doing, actually. So I think you'll see that story. And so what that symbolizes in some ways is that Citizens United really has allowed people who have money anywhere in the world, actually one way or another, to get it into the US political process. If you recall back during the Nixon administration, there was a guy who worked for Richard Nixon, who was his Secretary of Commerce, became the head of finance at the Committee to Re-elect, named Maurice Stans. And Maurice Stans would go around to corporate offices around the world and the country and collect satchels full of cash and bring it back for the Committee to Re-elect. That was the money that was used to pay the plumbers. That was the hush money. That's when Nixon says, I could get $1 million, that'd be easy. Mm-hmm. That's where it came from. So that's the impact. And anyway, that's my Citizens United reflections.
So do you have a clip?
Well, the clip is about also, at that time in the United States and the world, it was, it's illegal to pay off your local policeman or your mayor or your city council or any public official in the United States. There's a law against it. Federally, it's called the Hobbs Act, which is, by the way, what Gingrich's second wife was under investigation for. But because of what happened during Watergate, and you'll see this clip, the United States passed a law called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So, for example, if you go back to the New York Times article, which reported the $5 million donation, the first one to Gingrich, if you read all the way through to the end, you'll see he's currently under investigation for violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act for suspicions that he's been bribing public officials in Macau and in China to maintain his gambling license. So we became the first country in the world to outlaw bribing a public official in another country. Until 1977, you could deduct from your tax return those bribes. Until 1998, every other country in the world allowed that to happen. Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and so on. So, and there are only 30 countries in the world now that outlaw an international treaty, the payment of bribes to officials in another country to get business. It's legal in every other country.
30 countries outlaw it?
There's a treaty that, the OECD Treaty on the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development Treaty, which makes that illegal. It doesn't mean it's enforced. And this story that we did actually from here, from Berkeley, called Black Money, which was on Frontline, is about a $80 billion arms deal involving the Saudi government, primarily, and we get into other companies, with the Saudi royal family and the British BAE, a British company, which now actually does most of its business here in the US. But there's a little clip there we can play, the third one there with the Capitol, and give you a little primer on how this all started, how this became illegal in the United States. See if this works.
For decades, the United States was the only country in the world where it was illegal, where you could go to jail for bribing an official in another country to get business. That law emerged out of another era, with revelations of political corruption in the Watergate scandal.
I made my mistakes. Well, I'm not a crook.
During the Watergate hearings, it was revealed that major corporations made payments in cash to President Nixon's re-election campaign.
Did you make a contribution to the president's re-election effort?
I did. I called the controller of one of our companies in the Bahamas, told him I needed $50,000, and he brought it to me.
In what form was the $50,000?
It was in cash.
What sparked my interest was the fact that these were cash payments to the committee to re-elect the president, which came directly out of the corporate treasuries. And I knew that was illegal.
He was soliciting a contribution for President Nixon's campaign.
Stanley Sporkin was in charge of enforcement at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, which regulates publicly traded companies.
When you heard them talking about cash, what did you think?
How does Gulf Oil record a transaction of a $50,000 cash payment? I wanted to know, what account do they charge? Do they have an account called bribery? And so I decided to ask one of my investigators to go out and find out how they did it.
Stanley came in one morning and he was agitated, and he really wanted to know and was asking all of us, how could this happen? What are we going to do about this?
When we looked into these funds, we found out they were not only being used domestically in the United States for illegal campaign contributions, but we found that the same monies were being used to bribe officials overseas in connection with the company's business.
Sporkin's investigation found that 500 American companies had spent hundreds of millions of dollars bribing everyone from prime ministers to police overseas, which it turned out was not illegal.
Bribery was something you deducted from your tax returns.
Right. Companies deducted those payments just like any other regular expense. Bribing a foreign government official wasn't prohibited. It was something that people could do, and they got away with, and they got business as a result, and so they carried on.
We came up with a voluntary disclosure program, and some 500 or more companies eventually came in and made disclosures.
Hundreds of companies came in and confessed?
Yes.
I found out when I got in office that the Securities and Exchange Commission had gotten testimony from more than 100 corporate executives that they were involved in what I consider to be criminal activity, that is bribery. So I was very eager to see this practice stopped and ran into a hornet's nest because a lot of corporations claimed that they couldn't sell in competition with the French and British and others overseas if they didn't bribe officials who were in charge of making the purchases.
Despite strong opposition from corporate America, in late 1977, Congress passed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA, making it illegal for any company that uses the United States financial system to bribe to get business.
Around the world, I think everybody looked at the United States and thought, well, that's great, but not for us. So you had the statute passed, and Americans went abroad, and they had difficulty doing business because they knew that they could go to jail if they made payments to those foreign government officials.
Even though the Justice Department aggressively pursued and convicted major U.S. companies like General Electric, Lockheed, and Goodyear, other U.S. companies continued to bribe.
The culture had not changed. There was undoubtedly a tendency of companies that had been engaged in bribery prior to the FCPA to continue to pay bribes, but to become more careful in how it was done.
By the way, if you watch this is streamed online at pbs.org/frontline. One of the funnier parts of the film is the CIA explaining why they continue to bribe overseas, because that's what they do for a living. It's their patriotic duty. And they like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act because U.S. companies could spend more money than they could. And so it was competition.
So now they have more power?
Yeah, they had more power because they were the only U.S. entity bribing for a while, or in some countries. But, and you'll see this, I think this issue is going to arise not only in the case of Gingrich and his donor, but also this is one of the major planks in the Republican platform, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is pushing for the repeal or weakening of this law. Anyway.
Sort of following with the Citizens United ruling to some degree too. So since we're talking about that and bribing overseas, one of the purposes of having these international bureaus that are disappearing to some degree as far as sort of major media outlets is to investigate some of what's going on with our government overseas or in that government, whatever's going on in that government that needs to be revealed. But there's a lot of concern out there of sort of the disappearance of these international bureaus, and you're saying they may be disappearing from sort of the major traditional media places to some degree, but it still exists?
Well, I think the big crisis really and I remember speaking at the International House maybe 12 years ago, 13 years ago. It was a big crisis in network television news in particular, but in the news industry in general, because there were all these cutbacks going on back then, and one of the things that was happening was the closing of foreign bureaus. And this is before the internet really took off. And so there was a great concern about who's going to cover this and who's going to cover that. And it was true. I remember at CBS, we got rid of all of Latin America was being covered from Miami. NBC was the only network that by 2000 that had a bureau in south of the border in Mexico City. NPR wasn't as big or international as it is now. And there was real concern that we weren't covering the rest of the world. And in fact, by pulling back, there would be less real information coming from the rest of the world. I can tell you that today, with the rise of the internet, one of the interesting things is there's probably more international investigative reporting. And by that I mean, what does investigative reporting mean? In-depth reporting that looks beneath the immediate events or behind them and tries to find out what's really going on. There's more of that going on internationally now, I think, than ever before in my lifetime. There are more nonprofit organizations now around the world. There's an International Association of Investigative Reporters that meets annually. There's a group that will be coming here to Berkeley in April called the Organized Crime and the Organized Crime Reporting Project that's based in the former Warsaw Pact countries that I'm on the board of. That's a nonprofit that has support. There's a Center for Investigative Reporting in Manila. There are just almost anywhere you go. So there's a growth of this kind of reporting. There's support people are giving each other. I mean, just the other day, being able to download video from the internet. There are all kinds of things now that make covering the world a lot easier, not to mention access to documents and records and all kinds of other things.
So, but are people listening in the Bay Area, in the United States, the way they were? Is it harder to find this information if there's more people reporting it, but is it sort of lost in some of the noise of what's going on in the internet?
Well, the big problem with the internet, obviously, is it's like, I used to say it was a fire hose, now it's a waterfall, of information. What's reliable, what isn't reliable, and so on. I remember a project we did for PBS called News War, which part of it was interviews with Google and various people about the impact. This is about 6 years ago. At that time, Google was trying to develop an algorithm for reliability. They've given up, by the way. But Google is now getting much more involved in supporting investigative reporting. You'll see an announcement in the next month about that. The need for reliable information that gets beyond propaganda or gets beyond the surface, at least into a growing number of societies, and I think it's reflected in some of the internet companies that we deal with, is growing. Whether it's China, I mean, the Chinese are censoring, but the Chinese want information. Business people want information. Information about what's happening in different places is much more accessible than it ever was before. Not to say that the U.S. population is necessarily getting that information. We're doing another project out of the graduate school, our investigative reporting project with PBS and Canadian Broadcasting that'll be on in late March, which is a look at what's happened with News Corporation in the United Kingdom, where they've been breaking into people's voicemail and computers and bribing the police and so on. Pretty amazing, actually, story that you may have read about, but actually what they were doing was pretty interesting. Now, as part of that, one of my graduate students pulled a study up that was done at Stanford, apparently, that people who watch Fox News know less about what's really going on than people who don't watch television at all.
Well, and isn't that one of the problems on that level? I mean, one of the things that worries me is when you go on to Google now and you search, and I search, and they know, Google knows who I am and knows my political slant. And so the results I get versus the person watching Fox News, it's actually they're different results based on what your patterns are, which means I'm getting less information from sort of the opposite side of what I believe in and vice versa, which means it seems to me that sort of narrows us down in our ability to understand what's really going on.
And fragments the society.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
You're talking past each other when you're having conversations.
Right.
That's a major that simply is a major problem. Whether you're talking about Citizens United or the deregulation of the broadcast industry in terms of content, which has been going on since the mid-'80s, you have the ability now to do things, particularly through broadcasting, which is really the main public education system in this country, to do things you couldn't do before. There used to be the right of reply,
right.
The fairness doctrine. Now, I'm not saying that those were great and they weren't cumbersome to deal with, but they did force you, when you were doing a broadcast, for instance, to include the other side, to not call people names, to not shout and yell. That it's only because of deregulation that you have Rush Limbaugh. He couldn't have existed, right? Nor could the Roger Ailes invention of Fox News, in the way that it becomes polemical, have existed. So yeah, we have some. But on the other hand, other countries, Britain as a good example, if you looked at the tabloid press in Britain and what they were doing, that's pretty far out there as well. So it's not just here. But the optimistic side for me is that I see more demand. For instance, when I get introduced now, when people go on, you got an award here, and he went to work there, and he did this, and he did that. I got introduced once by Bill Moyers at a thing in New York, and he told the audience, Mr. Bergman is entering his 5th decade, in the business. And I can tell you, after 5 decades in the business, it wasn't so great 5 decades ago. So yes, there are problems, but we had 3 networks, and we called ABC almost a broadcasting corporation. They were the last network to have more than 15 minutes of nightly news. It was very hard to get jobs in the business. All the evening newspapers were closing because of the shift from hot type to cold type, that is offset. I go far back as being an apprentice typographer in New York City when I was in high school. And so access to the media, access to being able to print things, desktop publishing, being able to say things that other people might see and hear was much more limited. And the political views, remember 90% of the press in the United States, for instance, was opposed to Franklin Roosevelt, right? It wasn't that the newspapers were even-handed, and particularly the ones in San Francisco. It wasn't that people had that much access to real information. Watergate and that period, the Vietnam War and civil rights, is what really led to the explosion of what we call investigative reporting today. It wasn't even done by newspapers back then. I have to tell my students that back when I started out, if you wanted to do in-depth reporting, you basically did, or what we call muckraking in those days, you did it for magazines or books. Newspapers were not in the game.
Really?
Yeah, the first investigative team on a newspaper is 1968 at Newsday. It's not a Pulitzer Prize category till the 1980s. So understand that I think you need to have a kind of like historical perspective on what was the good old days, when most of the press in the 1960s in the South were, pro-segregation. Very few of them opposed segregation, as an example.
And publicly? I mean, that's how the way they...
publicly, there's a famous, actually in broadcasting, there's a famous case called the Red Lion case. the Supreme Court case. And what it resulted from was that the White Citizens Council in Jackson, Mississippi, had taken over the television license of a major broadcast outlet. I don't remember whether it was NBC or CBS. And they did the news. Okay? And there was a challenge to their license. By the way, you couldn't challenge a license today that way because of the regulation world in that day. And that case went up to the Supreme Court, and that established the idea that you had a right of reply, there could be fairness, and all kinds of other things could be imposed upon the holder of a broadcast license, which still today says on it that you are operating in the public interest. It's the most lucrative license the federal government, by the way, issues. Do you have any idea how much it costs today to renew your broadcast license? If you're the biggest station here in San Francisco, every 8 years now you have to do it. $100. That's because you're supposed to be operating in the original law that was passed in 1933. You're supposed to be operating in the public interest and convenience. You're a utility.
Well, and there's been some talk recently, right? Because during that time, sort of the Vietnam War era is when at least broadcast journalism started making a ton of money, and it started becoming a money machine, and then
it's still a money machine, by the way.
but not to the level where it was.
The average rate of profit of local stations in the United States is somewhere, usually in the last couple of years, between 30 and 40%.
And weren't we at like 60%?
You were up to 60, but so were newspapers.
Right.
Because newspapers had a legal monopoly.
But there's this concept of who's going to pay for it, pay for investigative reporting, and then sort of the concept that it should be a public service. It should be like Caltrans. It should be considered a utility that's paid for by tax dollars, so that it doesn't become this celebrity thing where people are spending tons of money for the.
Yeah, right.
Why are you laughing at me?
Well, I'm just remembering. Like, why did CBS, for instance, in the old days, have CBS Reports? Because they thought they had gone through the quiz show scandal, and they thought their license was in danger. The licenses that they had were in danger, so they put more news on, right? Or why is 60 Minutes on at 7 o'clock on Sunday? Do you know why?
I don't know why.
Anybody know why it's on Sundays, 7 o'clock? Why it was successful? It started out in 1968. We used to sit around in New York and talk about how come we're in the top 10, right? And when it started in 1968, it was moved around at different time spots because it wasn't getting an audience. Finally, in 1973, they put it on at 7 o'clock on Sunday. Because there was, and there still is, Sunday night is the only night that there are 4 hours of prime time, as opposed to 3 every other night, under the regulatory scheme of the FCC. The networks all wanted 4 hours, right? But the FCC said at that time, in the 1960s, said 1 hour then has to be for public interest and service broadcasting or children's programming. So the CBS decided, well, we don't want to use 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, or 10 o'clock for something like that. We'll use 7 o'clock when fewer people are watching. And they put 60 Minutes in that segment, and it worked. And it stayed there, and it's a protected time period, so the other networks can only run something like children's program. ABC had The Wide World of Disney for years, or every now and then NBC would try a magazine show at 7 o'clock. And so they're in a protected time slot. And so it's regulation that's the key to making money for them, because they don't want to tell anybody that. But that's the reality. If they would worry, Don Hewitt, who's passed away, would worry that they would move them to 8 or 9 o'clock at night, because then he'd have to compete against Dallas or something else.
Which would be a disaster.
Right, and then we'd lose.
Do you have a clip from the Scotland Yard part of that? Was that one of the ones you wanted to show?
No, that's just something that we're doing now.
Okay, that you were going to give us sort of a
Well, the Foreign
tease
Corrupt
into it.
Practices Act, by the way, is involved in this whole scandal in England, because News International is a subsidiary of the News Corporation, which is based in New York, the company that's run by Rupert Murdoch, the same one that owns Fox News. And what's happened in England, interestingly enough, is that one of the things that's come out is that for at least the last decade, we know this because they've admitted it, as a matter of practice, the News International newspapers in England were bribing Scotland Yard regularly. And I was telling you this story, which blew my mind. I hadn't seen this until I was in England 2 months ago. doing the story. It turns out this is not new, this scandal. It's actually been known for a long time in England. And 9 years ago, there was a hearing in Parliament, and two of the editors, if you've followed the story, you know the redhead Rebecca Brooks and this other guy, Andy Coulson, who became Cameron's press person, are there, sitting there, and the video camera's on. And a young member of Parliament, who turns out was gay, and he had to pay a price for this later, because they did what they call monster him afterwards, because of something a constituent told him, suspected that News of the World, and she was the editor, was paying the police because of a personal incident that happened in this person's life. So he decided, I'll ask. So he asked her. He said, do you pay the police? And she said, without missing a beat, yeah, sure, all the time. And then Coulson, after a couple of minutes of people sort of hubbub about it, breaks in and says, but we only do it when it's legal. You know that wasn't in the paper the next day? So people have known about it for a long time. The editor of The Guardian told us that after they wrote a story 2.5 years ago that talked about these secret payments that were made to hush people up whose phones had been hacked into, and they were getting $1 million settlements for stories that never ran, by the way. They ran that story. There was no pickup in the rest of the press in England, and he was visited by the assistant commissioner in charge of Scotland Yard and told he shouldn't pursue this story, there's nothing there. So that's the kind of, this is a very unusual story of the press, political power, and the police all together. And it, hopefully we won't have the same kind of situation here.
Right. But that's coming out, you're doing a...
Late March, that'll be on PBS and on Canadian Broadcasting at the same time.
Okay. How about the Saudi prince story?
Well, I brought this along simply because it's the only time that this whole issue has really been fleshed out on U.S. television in recent time. You probably...
Should we watch it?
Well, we didn't watch more of it, but I just wanted to, one of my favorite sound bites. So I interviewed Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who for 19 years was the Saudi ambassador to the United States. His nickname was Bandar Bush, because if you went into his mansion right outside of Washington, he had a grand piano, and it was filled with pictures of him with everybody in the Bush family. And father, son, George, so on. But I got to interview him, and as a result of this, he was recalled. And I asked him, because I asked people in Washington who I knew, reporters, what's the question you never ask him? Because he was a source for Bob Woodward, for New York Times reporters and everybody. And they said, well, no one ever asks him about corruption in Saudi Arabia. So why don't we look at this Bandar there, and I'll just tell you about his airplane after we see that. But there's Bandar. Why don't we just see that clip? Yeah, that's him there, the guy with the beard, right? But you have to hear him.
If I thought we had a monopoly on corruption.
Prince Bandar would not give us an interview today, but he did in 2001, when Frontline asked him about corruption and the Saudi royal family.
But the way I answer the corruption charges is this. In the last 30 years, we have implemented a development program that was approximately close to $400 billion worth. You could not have done all of that for less than, let's say, 350 billion. Now, if you tell me that building this whole country and spending 350 billion out of 400 billion, that we had misused or got corrupted with 50 billion, I'll tell you yes, but I'll take that any time. But more important, who are you to tell me this? I mean, I see every time all the scandals here or in England or in Europe. What I'm trying to tell you is, so what? We did not invent corruption. This happened since Adam and Eve. I mean, Adam and Eve were in heaven, and they had hanky-panky, and they had to go down to earth. So, I mean, this is human nature. But we are not as bad as you think.
Do you want to do questions?
So yeah, we'll open it up to questions, but I have one more question. What's it like when you're sitting, I mean, I know what it's like when I'm sitting there in an interview and you know it's good, you know, and you're hearing but that kind of interview, I mean, you rarely get an official being that candid about something. Who cares, you know? It's got to be pretty interesting. What were you thinking during that?
He's not supposed to drink. He's a Muslim.
Did you ask him?
I didn't have to ask him. What you do find, and maybe this is one way to look at it, a lot of investigative stories are actually right in front of your nose. And a lot of really good interviews are asking a question people don't ask because you want to be polite, or or maybe your job's on the line, or or there are various other factors that come to play. In this particular interview, he did something which public officials, and he was more or less a public official in the United States. He had immediate access to the White House. There's a lot of this, if you want to see his career, it's in this film. And even Jimmy Carter talked about them being really good friends and so on. So what happens in the daily reporting business is you don't want to piss off your sources. If you're covering the police department, for instance, and you're working local news, I remember people telling me, well, we don't want to do that about the police department because we depend as a local news station on being called or notified when there's a disaster, a car accident, a fire, or whatever. And if we do stuff that they don't like, we may not get called. And that started in the print business when I was in the newspaper business, and it also happens in the TV business. It happens in Washington, where public officials know that the way to get good press is to become an off-the-record source for powerful journalists. And then they rarely ever get the same treatment as anyone else. The former senator from Nevada, Paul Laxalt, who was the co-chairman of Ronald Reagan's re-election campaign and his close friend, the White House used to say that they didn't leak. He was the official leaker. So he leaked.
That was his job?
He was basically the leaker, yeah. And I remember trying to do a story about him, and anyway, that's a story that never ran, and I'll tell you about it sometime in my memoir.
Well, and that's so frustrating too, because it's one of those things where on the local level also, I mean, I interviewed the governor, Schwarzenegger, and asked him some questions that really annoyed him and annoyed his press person. And he pulled me in afterwards, the press person said, "You're blackballed, you're never allowed in here again." And so the folks who have access to the governor or the mayor or the president are the ones who aren't going to ask those questions, because you don't get invited back. If you have to sort of be willing to throw it out one time and not get invited back.
Right, and cut out, or or go back to your office and find out you got fired.
Right, that too, which is always fun. All right, so we should open it up for questions, because I could keep going, but I bet you guys have questions too. So we've got microphones set up on both sides up here if anybody wants to get up and come up and ask Lowell a question. And
Or you.
Or me. Or me. You can ask me a question too, absolutely.
By the way, people sometimes, even if you've seen the movie, I've lived in Berkeley since 1973. I only moved once for 9 months to play executive at ABC News. I moved back. And there was a great advantage of staying in Berkeley, which is that I had established a lifestyle that was very low budget, and I didn't have to worry about getting fired, because I always figured I was going to get fired.
That was part of the deal?
Yeah, well,
you
you got to be ready to go.
Pushing the envelope? Yeah. Go ahead.
Do you know if anybody is working on an investigation of the California prison system? It seems to me the poster program for corruption and incompetence and destruction for 30 years.
In my business, you cannot have any expectation that if you do a story, anything will change. Okay? I did 7 segments of 60 Minutes on the California prison system, starting with Pelican Bay in 1991, which is the Supermax, the first Supermax prison, running through the healthcare system, gladiator fights at Corcoran Prison, prison construction, you name it. The overwhelming mail to 60 Minutes, and this is before the internet, so I think they still do. They read all the mail, right? They really actually do. Writing letters is actually a very important thing to do, if snail mail. They take it much more seriously than internet comments or emails. And the overwhelming mail after Pelican Bay was build more of them. But you know, I think the only change that will happen in the California prison system is because of the economy and the recent decision by this 3-judge panel to release 30,000 inmates, which is actually being supported now for economic reasons because, as you know, the prison system, more money is spent on the prison system than on higher education in the state. And how long can you do that?
George?
There was news reports early on in the Iraq War that $1 billion in $100 bills and cash went over there. Do you have any educated guess about, you know, where that money went and maybe how much came back to the United States in different ways? Or have you heard anything on that? Because that sort of disappeared after people just sort of mentioned it.
There are a number of federal investigations ongoing trying to track down what happened to literally tons, because they waited, you know, when they flew it over there in huge pallets, and it disappeared. Billions of dollars disappeared. Allegedly, it's still under investigation. That's all I know.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to ask if you'd give us a sense of why there's been a rise in NGOs working to combat corruption internationally, and a sense of which you think are most effective. Perhaps if you have a view on Transparency International, I'd be interested. Thank
you might want to look at the documentary because it gets into the expansion of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act as a law that was then adopted by 30 countries takes place primarily because right after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Western European countries and the US were really concerned. Western Europe, by the way, everybody bribed, and they still do, more or less. The French and the Germans have just done their first big prosecution on Siemens Corporation. You know, they paid $1.6 billion in fines. But there was a real fear that the opening of the markets in the former Soviet bloc meant that you would have to bribe. And therefore, not just for all kinds of reasons, they wanted a level playing field. So you saw what becomes this OECD convention where people start signing it. Mm-hmm. Then they have to implement it, and that's been the whole problem of implementation. But the primary reason that there's concern about corruption and bribery is that it leads to instability in almost any society where it's rampant. That's a huge problem, for instance, that you don't hear about here, that's in the provincial press, for instance, in China. The Chinese central government is they're not too concerned about the bribery and corruption at the central government, but of the level of it in the country in general. And it's a huge problem. You're going to read an incredible story in the New York Times. I don't know exactly when, because this friend of mine said originally to me, well, I know him, it always takes him longer. But it's going to be about a major US company involved in a big country south of the United States, and how bribery by this company transformed this country and led to a huge increase in illegal immigration into the United States. So it is an ongoing, you know, the Transparency and others estimate that the bribery economy is about $1 trillion a year worldwide. I think it's just a number they pull out of the hat because nobody knows. But it is a major problem worldwide, and governments are concerned about it, particularly from the stability point of view.
Well, this is quite open-ended, but given what you said about how journalism has evolved over time, right? What you said about how journalism has changed over time,
right,
from 50s to like today's. What, according to you, are the biggest challenges to investigative journalism today?
Well, it was always a couple of same challenges. Having enough money and resources to do the story, to do the research and reporting, I think that's actually a lot better than it was 40 years ago. 40 years ago, if you were a reporter and you were trying to do an investigation, there was only one nonprofit you could go to get any money to help you do it in the United States, and there was none in the rest of the world. Now that they're all over the place and there is money and foundations do put money, as do wealthy individuals, the laws are a lot better in the United States than they were, but the fear of being sued, for instance. Mr. Adelson, the donor to Newt Gingrich, is famous in our business for suing reporters. We have an annual symposium in April where we bring investigative reporters from literally around the world here to Berkeley. And on one panel, we had a reporter from Las Vegas who wrote something not complimentary about Mr. Adelson about 8 years ago, and he sued him. It was in a book. So book publishers don't usually back you up. You know, you hold them harmless. So he's a columnist, but he wrote it in a book. He got sued. He was sued into bankruptcy. His daughter, he tells the story of his daughter developing brain cancer, and he has no medical insurance anymore. And the attorney on the other side came to him and said, Mr. Adelson will pay for your daughter's operation. You just have to apologize. Luckily, a local attorney intervened and represented him for free, and they wound up winning the suit. But so that kind of fear is still there. But in this country, we're relatively safe. In most countries doing this kind of work, you're taking your life in your hands. There was an assassination here in Oakland a couple of years ago. That's a very rare event. The last one before that in an English language newspaper, not a foreign language newspaper in the United States, was in 1976 in Arizona. If you are a foreign language press person in the United States, let's say Colombian newspapers that serve the Hispanic community or Chinese community or Filipino community, you could be in danger here in the United States. But basically what I'm trying to say is here in the US, we're relatively safe.
But isn't there a bit of a problem as far as the local investigative? So there's money out there for some of those, for the grants and things, but locally, I mean, my station and the other stations have all cut back like crazy. And the level of investigation has been cut back over time because we've got to produce it every night. But there were people doing it and sitting in on city council meetings every Tuesday night and paying attention at that level. And it seems like that level is losing.
Yeah, the biggest complaint I get locally is from judges, cops, and attorneys, that the courts are not being covered. You know, that either print or broadcast, they might show up for the opening argument and the closing argument, nobody's in the courtroom. And that basically the local institutions are not being monitored.
Right.
Right here at the university, one of my graduate students did this great study. It's on file at the J School, and it was in the Bay Citizen version of the New York Times as a shorter article. You'll see more about it, about this huge stadium right next door here, $500 million, right? And who's going to pay for it? You know, and the fact is the university has now admitted what my student thought was going on, and finally after he finished, they did admit it, that it's going to have to be paid for by the students. You know, that the plan to sell seats, the plan that they had to pay it off, isn't going to work. They're not selling the seats. Not even the regent who I know personally, who proposed the whole rebuilding of the stadium and pushed it through as the chairman of the Board of Regents and brought in the people who did the economic analysis and set up the plan, he hasn't even bought a seat. So that's going to be, now nobody's really covering that locally, right?
Well, and partly it takes time, and partly a lot of it isn't sexy, and as ratings have gone down, it's become more of a fight for the rating point to make the money than to try to tell the story. Because you got to make the money in order to get us employed, and so there's this rat race that's going the opposite direction.
And this kind of reporting is trouble.
Yeah, and it's
You know,
trouble.
it's a
and
headache.
it takes a long time.
Right. So if I can do, sex and rock and roll,
Right.
why do I want to have any problems so that I have to answer the phone on the weekend?
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
How do you feel that today's journalistic community is adapting to the use of citizen journalism in terms of video, audio, balancing the use and confirming legitimacy?
Yeah, I just think that it's all great. The problem is I don't even have time to read. I mean, myself, and as much as I want. And I think the question really is journalism community getting. I think we're moving back to the idea that you need an editor. It's great that everybody's got a camera. I mean, it's amazing. People have these HD cameras in their phone. I mean, when it used to cost $100,000.
Right here.
Right. I mean, so the scale of what you can do now and so on is all very incredible. And it used to be that I used to threaten that at the networks that I was going to do something which I used to lecture about here at Berkeley, which I call the grammar of television news, or how it's actually what you're used to watching on TV, which is in your subconscious now, and how that's done. And the networks never wanted to explain to a mass audience how it's done, right? What a cutaway is, how the editing goes on, what's a teleprompter, who's that person on camera, do they really know what they're talking about, who actually did the reporting, reveal, what goes into the sausage, basically. And every time I would propose it, the executives, whether it was at 60 Minutes or, I would say at 60 Minutes, why don't we show them what we actually do?
No.
Right?
Yeah.
I get laughed out of the room. So now everybody has access to these things, cameras, editing on your computer, on your laptop. Younger people especially understand the grammar of how, and I think that's really important. That's really one of the big developments, that because the technology has improved in so many ways and advanced, people now know what they're seeing, which is why they're watching Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart and think that that's more reliable because they know it's phony when they see phony
Right.
on TV.
And oftentimes Colbert and Stewart show the phony more than the newscasts, the regular newscasts do. They expose it in a humorous way. Go ahead.
So what are your thoughts on WikiLeaks and its role in aiding investigative journalism by providing so much raw data that provides accountability and transparency?
Boy, no. I was looking at my watch because,
Where do you
let me explain a couple of things. First of all, Julian Assange was here in Berkeley 3 years ago at our gathering, before he was world famous, and whispering or he was alluding that he had something that was really going to shake the world. At that point, he had only released a couple of things. So I'm pretty familiar with him and the issues, and have found a lot of the cables and other things extremely useful in reporting. And I think it's a great phenomenon in general. I think we haven't looked at closely at a couple of things. One is, I believe that WikiLeaks dump, if you will, of documents, allegedly from Bradley Manning, right, is unusual and is unlikely to happen anything like that anytime soon, at least from the US government. It's interesting that the only way Bradley Manning, if he was in fact guilty of this, could do what he did is because General Petraeus, who was then in charge of, and he's never been asked about this publicly, again because by reporters who I've yelled at, who I know because he's a great source for people, is the general actually who is responsible for leaving the CD-ROM writable drive in those laptops, so that he could actually, all of the USB ports were closed down on those laptops because of a security assessment. So it was a massive bonehead move by whoever was in charge, and nobody's really gotten into that, number one. Number two, the access to large amounts of information is, again, one of the reasons why, quote, investigative or in-depth reporting is somewhat easier now, because there is a lot of information out there on a lot of different subjects that would never have been available unless you had this technology. The real question, I think, that's still unresolved is how do you deal with it responsibly and present it reliably, all this information, and how do you judge whether it's true or not? You know, because you could have a situation, let's say, like where Dan Rather buys into a particular document about George Bush, and it appears to be a forgery. So how do you know anymore? Now you can type with, you know, Photoshop and whatnot. You can make things that look real. So I think that's going to be the real problem: is how to sort out what's true and what's not.
Same for consumers too, right? Where there's news coming out from all these different sources you don't
Right.
know, and so you're taking these things without really knowing what the purpose or the motive behind the folks who are putting that information out there.
Right. So
Right?
you have a situation where, but the behavior, which is interesting, the behavior is that the consumer, in terms of who goes on the internet, is to reliable names. You know, whether it's the New York Times or the Guardian, for instance, in England, their print newspaper is shrinking in subscriptions, and their web presence is exploding. Right. In fact, they're moving 14 reporters to the United States because most of their web views now are coming from the U.S. So people are going to, like, various sites, I think, looking for reliability.
Sorry if this is an obtuse question as well, but what's your perspective on the rise of investigative journalism in developing countries where rule of law is a problem, and how important do you think educational systems that stress analytical skills are, or whether that can be taught?
Investigative reporting taught?
Well, American-centric investigative reporting.
Well, you know, I have my favorite art object in our offices over on Hurst Street is a obsessive-compulsive doll. Because to be in this business, you really have to be compulsive to really keep pushing away. So it takes a peculiar kind of personality usually to get into this kind of work, and then you can learn it. It's not rocket science. None of what we do is really rocket science. You know, we're actually vocational workers who just got obsessed about particular subject areas. In other countries, things are a lot tougher, just traditionally and otherwise, in terms of being able to publish and be safe. You know, in Mexico, we don't realize it, but regularly scores of reporters are killed every year, and that's been going on for a long time. Now, the rules are different. You know, in Mexico, like in a political campaign, reporters expect that they're going to be paid by the candidates. Okay? I mean, there are different rules, and things are not exactly the way that they are as strict as they are here. In other countries, for instance, people expect to get paid for giving interviews. So the rule of law is not what it is here. There are countries where you can do it. Israel, for instance, if you look at the Israeli press, when people talk about, get criticized for criticizing Israel, you should look at the Israeli press. I mean, they just tear each other apart, you know. So they have the rule of law. You can do that. You can't do that, obviously, in a lot of other places. India is famously corrupt, and there's an interesting story. There was an investigative, internet-based investigative outlet, and it also had video, and they conspired to bribe the Indian defense minister on camera, and they did it. It cost them $30,000 to get to him, you know, to bribe people to get to him, and they recorded it with hidden cameras, and they put it on the internet. This is about 5 years ago, and if I'm correct, and the consequences for them were they immediately got raided by the Indian tax authorities and put out of business. So, you know, it's not a business where you never expect to get an award. You don't expect necessarily for things to change. It's that's maybe the only people who survive in the business have to be used to the idea that you'll probably wind up in jail or worse. That's what my mother kept telling me.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm a first-year Chinese-Canadian international student, and people mentioned that you covered the 2008 Beijing Olympic, and I'm just wondering, it's nothing about bribery.
I didn't bribe anyone, I swear.
When you get to China, did it live up to your standard, or did you get to know some journalism in China, and did you learn some Chinese and have some
I learned a little
nice
Chinese, and I'm not
food?
even going down that road because very little. But I tried to be polite while I was there. I'll tell you what I thought was the most interesting of being there and covering it and being welcomed as a foreign journalist to cover the Olympics, and particularly the week beforehand and the year beforehand, even when there weren't a lot of other journalists there, where they kind of hadn't set it up yet, didn't know how it was going to work. So they open arms coming in. Show us, and I'm there to do stories about, where the athletes are going to be staying and things that they can see while they're there. I mean, it was more almost like a tourism type of story. But so it felt very friendly and open, and as if, you could be in any country. And then my favorite moment was being on Tiananmen Square, and I had a translator with me at all times, which we did all sort of assume was a spy of some sort. I mean, there was a government person, right, who was checking on what we were doing.
A minder.
A minder, exactly. So, so we were standing there, and we were interviewing some folks, and she was keeping track of us, and there were the square is ginormous, huge, right? But I saw some people who had been there longer than others while we were standing there, and people were coming and going, and there was people scattered around, and I sort of thought to myself, I wonder if those all are people keeping track of me, And so I asked to walk to the other side of the square, and literally a whole crowd walked to the other side of the square with me. And I thought, I'm thinking perhaps these people are all keeping track of me. And it was very interesting. Even my phone was bugged while I was there, and it looked like the person, a friend of ours who's a reporter there, I was describing some of the stuff that was going on the phone, and he said, there's no question that your phone was bugged, and I'd be shocked if they weren't, even if you couldn't have heard it, but you could hear it. And it was weird. I mean, there was an echo to a lot of it that I didn't get on my other phone, on the cell phone that I was trying to use sometimes, and sometimes that was blocked. All the internet stuff was obviously blocked along the way. But so that, I thought it was sort of interesting, because they were really trying to reveal this open society, and yet, they just sort of couldn't help themselves on trying to keep control of me and what I was doing while I was there, which I found relatively interesting for my short visit while I was there.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Yes, so I'm from Norway, and it's a much smaller country, much smaller markets. So you can say that with the struggle that journalism, the media has in just staying alive because of the profit pressure, just to have the income. So investigative journalism is kind of like not as profitable as more tabloid. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on how this is a threat to democracy? Because without investigative journalism, you cannot uncover corruption among politicians and all that. And how internet is making this more and more fragmented and kind of taking away the revenue source. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on as we go forward, as internet is making this more and more fragmented? How do you think, especially in smaller markets, not necessarily here, but in smaller markets, how can you kind of ensure that democracy is preserved?
Well, first of all, I mean, we had one international conference actually on investigative reporting in Norway, and Norway, I guess because you guys have handled your oil revenues so well, is one of the few countries that hasn't been gone down. The economy hasn't really been impacted the way everyone else has, and the government is very generous, not only about journalism, but also about fighting corruption, and has funded something called the Corruption Hunters, which is a amalgam of a gathering of corruption investigators from around the world, and they subsidize that. So I would say, just from my experience in Norway, and also doing something about Siemens in Norway, which was a big deal about how they were bribing the military, Siemens Corporation. Siemens Corporation, by the way, has now admitted that they bribed since the end of the Second World War as routine. And if you look at there's a section of the documentary we don't have to see, but you can meet the guy who filled up the bags full of cash for Siemens in Stuttgart and sent people out with it all around the world to deliver it for bribery on a regular basis. And he was the only person who went to jail, unfortunately. But and he said the reason he was, by the way, in charge of this is he was considered to be the most honest person in the corporation. but
those were the qualifications.
But just what I said about 60 Minutes, you know, that it's a protected time period. The government set that up, and there was a belief, I think, when broadcasting was sort of organized, in particular as a form of journalism 70 years ago, that in the United States, that it could be manipulated and used for totalitarian purposes. That was reinforced, obviously, after the Second World War with regulations. And I think that you have to, we like to say, and people in the news business in the United States traditionally like to say that we're independent of the government, we don't want any government control, we want to all be free and independent. And the fact is, the news business, the serious news business in the United States has almost always been subsidized in some way by the government. And most people don't know that the reason why the Examiner and the Chronicle, you know, they were the first joint operating agreement in the newspaper business in the mid-1960s. What they did at that time as an economic arrangement was technically illegal under the antitrust laws. It was legalized by Congress in 1970. So that for newspapers to survive in the United States, the government of the United States decided that they were going to allow them to operate as monopolies and or print out of the same facility, share the same trucks, do all these, share the same building, even though they're different companies. And so those newspapers survived with huge profits. And we do that at different stages in our history. And other countries do it regularly. Now, you might say they do it too much in other countries. You know, for instance, in Mexico, I don't know if it's still true, but when I did a story down there in the Salinas regime, I know up to that point, in the mid-90s, the government of Mexico controlled all the newsprint in the country. So if you wanted to print a newspaper, you had to get it from the government, right? And that's the way to keep people in business and out. On the other hand, the government, as the people, have to, in a sense, contribute to and in various ways promote this kind of reporting. Why do you like NPR? Clear Channel and all these things happen in radio. They got rid of news, right, on the radio. Remember there used to be commercial radio news in the United States? It's disappeared. NPR is a nonprofit. That means taxpayers are subsidizing it indirectly because it's a nonprofit. And, you know, people can give it money. And it's got a huge audience. It's got the biggest radio audience in the country. So people want it, then you have to, BBC and so on, you've got to support it. And other countries do it, and some of them have better media than we do, particularly on a local level.
Take your question, then your question, and I think we're about finished, out of time at that point.
Okay, hi, I'm a student from Egypt, and this time last year I was in Tahrir Square. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm a student from Egypt, and this time last year I was in Tahrir Square. So I just wanted to ask if you, my question is composed of two parts. First, if you think that there were any international relations that led to the uprising, and if the international community is trying to push the revolution into a certain direction, if you know anything about it.
I don't have any peculiar insight into what the international community is. I think everybody was surprised, you know, which is always, you know, fall of governments that you think are stable, and you know they need a strong man, you know, and so on, and that whole the courage of the people in the Arab world and Syria. You know, unfortunately, I think your part of the world it has to still undo what the West did back in Versailles in dividing up the world. You know, I did spend quite a bit of time, I didn't spend a lot of time in Egypt, but I've spent quite a bit of time in Lebanon and Iraq under Saddam. You know, what's the problem in Iraq? It was not really a country. It was created by the French and the British and out of provinces of the Ottoman Empire. And so they're dealing with that reality, whether they stay together or not. Look at the Saudis. What was their response to Egypt? It was to up the income of everybody in Saudi Arabia to keep them quiet, right? But it's still true that their big fear, the royal family's big fear in Saudi Arabia is the Shia, who they suppress, the minority who actually live where all the oil is. So, but that's what the West is worried about, or the Chinese are worried about, is where are we going to still get our oil? It's our oil, by the way. You know. And we obviously are going to face, we're obviously going to face a major crisis in Iran very soon. But
And were you in the square? Yeah. So is the local reporter hat coming on? Can I get your name afterwards? So we're always looking for the local angle to that story and trying to vote. Do you live here at the I House? Yeah. Yeah?
Okay.
Very good. I can track you down.
See, you got a story out of it.
Exactly. Working all the time, right?
Right.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm wondering, after all the stories that you've done, how much do you trust our government?
Well, let me put it a different way. Our government is people. So, you know, here I am, I live in Berkeley, and I remember I was one of the first reporters, and I used to work at Rolling Stone. This is back in 1970. Rolling Stone moved in 1976, and that's when that was the first time I got fired, because I wouldn't move to New York. But in 1978, I went into the, I think it was 77 or 78, I went into the J. Edgar Hoover building for the first time. They had finally set up a press office at the FBI. They didn't have an official press office until then. And I found over time, for instance, from trusting people, that I could develop sources in the FBI. Now, I'll make no secret about it, I have an FBI file. There were people initially at the FBI who wouldn't talk to me because they thought I was a communist revolutionary. Or anarchist, that was what it was, because they couldn't, in my file, if I showed it to you, they can't figure out what organization I belonged to, but I didn't, so they put anarchist. I'm not particularly in favor of the US drug laws, but I know people who are narcotics agents for the DEA and veterans who are very smart and very trustworthy. So I think you have to look at the government, from my perspective, it's a professional thing, but I look at it as people. Now, in general, will the government lie or the government not tell us the truth? In a sense, our government probably tells us the truth more often than most other governments do. We may not want to accept it, but the fact is that there's a lot more information available, not as much as I would like, but there's a lot more information available about how the US government works than most other governments. Example, you could not have national security, and I think I was here doing a panel with Daniel Ellsberg, you know, in the wake of WikiLeaks and all that, and the Obama administration, this is it's very surprising, I think, to journalists. The Obama administration has prosecuted more leakers and subpoenaed more reporters to grand juries than all the administrations of the United States combined. So if you're worried about reporting on national security issues, this administration has been tougher than any other administration in memory that anybody can remember. But in most countries in the world, if you were to report, for instance, had Julian Assange's documents been about the British government, he would be in jail in Britain. You can't publish that in Britain. His documents were all American documents, so he didn't get prosecuted. You can't do it in Canada. National security reporting, which we have in this country, granted it's not as vibrant as maybe it should be, but national security reporting is unique to the United States. No other country, and partially because, and it was unique, it didn't really exist prior to Cy Hirsch and the My Lai story in 1969 and then Pentagon Papers opening things up. It didn't exist in this country. You know, you didn't write about those things. You didn't write about whether the president was having a gangster's mistress in his closet and in the White House and having sex, and you didn't write about secrets. And when you did, well, things happened. It didn't happen very much. Nobody did it. They were afraid to do it.
Okay, one more question.
I know you you did quite a bit of reporting that was slightly more dangerous. You did Yakuza kind of stories.
Oh, the
going way
Yakuza,
back. Yeah, Yakuza.
That's
And I
the
was
guys
just-
with no pinkies. The Japanese mob people
I was just wondering if, given the number of years you've been doing this, if there's either, if there's been times when you've been concerned for your safety, or what was the most concerned that you were, what story was the most dangerous to you personally?
The most dangerous is when you're working for like a small publication, like what happened here in Oakland. The most dangerous is when you're a freelancer and you don't have an organization behind you. In San Diego in 1970, that's how my first international story actually was, we had a small weekly newspaper in San Diego with very kind of conservative daily newspaper. It was always rated as one of the 10 worst in America, the San Diego Union and Tribune. And, you know, a couple of TV stations. And military was retirement area as well as huge military staging area for the war, Vietnam. And right on the border, and right across the border was this then relatively small town called Tijuana. And what we discovered was, all we were doing was doing public record searches about who really owned the city and county of San Diego and who were the most, you know, in a sense, hidden powerful people and institutions. And it didn't take us very long to figure out who that was, because they only appeared usually on the society pages. They were never in the regular newspaper. And one of the guys, a guy named John Alicio, had the concession on gambling in northern Mexico. He was also the major campaign money behind Pat Brown. He was a Democrat, and there was a Republican named Arnold Smith, and he had the biggest bank in town. He was Mr. San Diego of the century, and his particular political friend was Richard Nixon. We had backed since 1946. So we started to profile these people, and we went down to Tijuana and did the stories about the racetrack and things like how they actually ran the racetrack that they didn't like. And so that's a little newspaper, basically freelancing, doing it for really no money. You know, we had things happen like our only car that was insured, that was a good idea, was blown up, right? The newspaper was taken out of its racks regularly and thrown in the bay. I was arrested for waking up in the morning, literally. I mean, the police would come into our houses, into our apartments, and arrest us. And luckily, we found a judge who actually gave us, you know, own recognizance release forms, you know. It was stamped with his signature so we could hand it in when we got booked and then go out the other door. So in that kind of situation, and where you don't have like a major media organization or you don't have any resources, that's the most dangerous situation. But since then, and much to my surprise, 3 or 4 years later, I was actually making a living doing this. And, you know, there have been some dangerous moments, but they're not, you know, they're not like that. You know, and so that's where you really should look. Local reporting, breaking new ground, saying what everybody knows, for instance, but won't talk about. That's the most dangerous, and that's where you're going to get squashed first. That's where the pushback comes. And you know, when I was freelancing back in '75, we did a guy named Jeff Girth and I were still friends. He worked we worked together at the New York Times later and have been friends since then. We freelanced a story for Penthouse magazine. They were paying good money then. And it was on the owners of the casinos in Las Vegas who had graduated. This is when the Teamsters Pension Fund, nobody was writing about it. It was like the mafia's sort of bank. And how they had moved to San Diego and started something called the La Costa Country Club. And what was going on in the relationship between power and what we would call organized crime. Now, we got sued for $630 million when that was real money. But we knew we had graduated because they sued us.
It's funny that you say the local thing, because my most dangerous moment was in Butte, Montana. My first television job. Grew up here, but ended up in Butte, and that was an old mining town.
Right.
And I went in to do, the mining company invited us in to do a feature about how neat it was to be a miner. So I said, okay, you know, I'm 23. And so I put my little hat on, and I put on the stuff, and we go down into the mine, and I was stunned at the working conditions down there and what was going on. They didn't have masks, and they're drilling into these, and they would disappear. They'd start to drill, and their bodies would just disappear into the dust. No masks, no nothing. So I came back out and said, I have an incredible story, you know, and immediately the news director said, that's not happening. They're the largest employer in town. It's, you can't do it. So I did it on a Friday night when there was no management around because I couldn't let it go, and I did it very minor. And I had death threats, and I had to have security take me to and from home and that kind of thing. And one time I had an old apartment, so I don't know, but the gas light on my stove went out.
Pilot light?
The pilot light went out in the middle of the night. And luckily, a coworker lived in the apartment next to me, and we were supposed to go to work together, and I didn't get up. And she banged on the door and eventually got somebody to get in, and I was passed out with and it could have been an old stove, but it was all during the same time. And I thought, you know, that's totally not fun, because I'm not making enough money to do that. Nor do you ever in the business. But that was the only time for me where it was that level. I mean, you know.
Right. Well, I would say that maybe a last thing is that we were talking about this earlier. How do you explain that this area with major universities, highly educated population, liberals, you know, has such terrible media coverage of the communities themselves and newspaper historically? Now,
and I was concurring, by the way, on it, despite the fact I do
you know,
my best, but
the broadcasting here invented Happy Talk, you know, for local news back 40 years ago. I suggested there is as I do to my students, that you read Lincoln Steffen's The Muckraker 100 years ago, and he has an autobiography, and there's a whole set of chapters on San Francisco. Very little has changed.
We'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
I'm going to stay out of that conversation.
Lowell Bergman, Diane Dwyer, thank you for a fascinating evening.